So I just want to welcome our viewers to women's suffrage in the U.S., reflections on the 100th year anniversary of the 19th Amendment. My name is Joshua Cohen. I am the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at High Library, and we are sponsoring this panel discussion on the 19th Amendment along with the Political Science Department and the Women and Gender Studies program. Today, in celebration of the 100-year anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, we will be discussing the legacy of the women's suffrage movement and the history of women in American politics. I want to welcome everybody on the online panel. We've already been chatting a little bit, and as well as my co-moderator, Etown student Matthew Smith. I want to thank you all for participating in today's discussion. I also want to thank Rachel Grove-Rohrbaugh, the High Library archivist, for putting together a guide of resources on related to the 19th Amendment and the suffrage movement. You can find that linked from our Facebook page. We'll start with some introductions. I'm going to let everybody here do their own self-introduction. And if the panelists want to make any kind of introductory remarks as well, you're welcome to do that, but you don't have to. And then we'll get into the discussion. I'd like to add that we will have time towards the end of the program for some audience questions, which can be submitted through the Zoom chat feature. So it should be at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to submit those a little bit later, sort of towards the end of our time. And we can go ahead and then get started. So Matt, since you're my co-moderator, would you like to introduce yourself first, please?
Absolutely, yeah. So my name is Matt Smith. I'm a senior history and Middle Eastern Studies major, religious studies minor here at the college. And thank you to the High Library and the Political Science Department for allowing me to co-moderate this panel with you, Josh. And I want to wish everybody a happy National Voter Registration Day, an appropriate day to have this panel on.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm excited to really get into this conversation.
Thank you, Matthew.
I'm Fletcher McClellan. I'm a professor of political science here at the college. And just 5 days ago was Constitution Day, so we'll want to recognize that as well.
Nice. Thank you, Fletcher.
Great. I'm Christina Hartman. I am a Democratic politician, as it were. I've run for Congress here in what was once Pennsylvania's 16th district, is no longer in Lancaster County. I used to cover Lancaster, Chester, and Berks counties 4 years ago, which we were just saying seems like 500 years ago, but here we are. And I most recently ran for Auditor General here in Pennsylvania, a statewide race in the primary that ended on June 2nd. So when I'm not doing that, I work in international development, specifically on democracy, governance, and human rights around the world.
Thank you, Christina.
And I'm April Kelly-Woessner, and I'm the Dean of the School of Public Service at Elizabethtown College. And my background is political science. My training is in political psychology, so I spend a lot of time thinking about why people do the things that they do, and hopefully we can have some conversations about why the suffragists chose the tactics they chose and why their opposition acted the way that it did. And so if we can get into some social science why questions, that would be really fun and exciting for me.
Thank you. So I'm going to start off the questions, and anybody can take up those questions. So the first question that we have is there anything about the fight to pass the 19th Amendment that most folks don't know about or that is misunderstood?
Okay, I'll jump in since there was a pause. I'm a good professor. I know how to fill a pause. I think one of the things, I teach a women in politics course on occasion, and so I have the advantage of seeing what surprises students when we have these conversations. And I think one of the things that we sometimes don't appreciate is the importance of the socio-political context of the time, and how much the opposition to the suffragist movement wasn't just about opposition to women voting. It was also about opposition to temperance and the fear that women were going to bring in the temperance movement. It was also racism. A lot of the opposition to the women's suffrage movement came from the South, and the fear that if you enfranchised Black women, that you were going to shift the politics of the South in racial ways. And then the importance of World War I. And I think we can't underestimate the impact that World War I had on putting pressure on Wilson, of allowing the suffragists to prove how useful women could be during a wartime and make a political statement that way. And so we can talk about that a little bit throughout the conversation, but I think the socio-political context of the time, if you had put the movement in any other time period with any other political context, different tactics, different things would have worked better or worse, depending.
Yeah, I would say, what strikes me, and I agree with everything that April said, is just the daunting nature of the constitutional amendment process, of what the Constitution has set up. To get 2/3 of the Congress to agree on anything these days, but on a controversial amendment, and then 3/4 of the states, which was 36 then, it's 38 now, is an enormous obstacle course. And of course, all of these states, all the legislatures, members of Congress, they're all men. And as we've seen with the Equal Rights Amendment, just being able to clear that hurdle, as we know, just if we go back to Seneca Falls, it's 70 years. And we're talking about representing not just some small minority group or some technical issue. We're talking about half the population. That's half the population, 70 years to accomplish this struggle. It's amazing.
Yes, and while I should also clarify, I'm not an expert in this category of work in the same way that our professors on this call are. I think, and Fletcher alluded to this just a moment ago, sort of how interesting it is to look back on this 19th Amendment, particularly with a lens from today. And so I think one of the things that, although I don't know if it's misunderstood or that most folks don't know about it, or if it's interesting to students, April, to your point, but one of the things that I see happening in the past year or so is that, the role of Black women and the fight for the vote. And the way that while we honor many white women, such as Elizabeth Stanton, she in particular didn't necessarily want Black men, for example, getting the vote before white women did. And interestingly to me, many of the conversations that we're having today about race in this country are ones that stem from centuries ago, and we seem to keep revisiting them, not resolving them in whole, maybe resolving them in teeny tiny parts, and really having big, big steps to go. So I think that's an important point for us to think about, which I'm sure we'll get to later on in the conversation.
Actually, that's a great segue, because we'd like to talk about the legacy of the women's suffrage movement today, and the voting rights movement today. So if anyone wants to comment more specifically on those issues, about the contemporary nature of those struggles, that's open to the floor. So Christina, if you want to expand on your points, or Dr. McClellan or Dr. Kelly-Woessner, if you want to jump in.
I would just say, that their legacy is women's active participation in our political system as voters in elected positions, as people who run for office, and they're all at the table where decisions are being made. And I'll also probably sound a little bit like a lot of the clips that you're hearing about RBG right now, because a lot of the phrases that I was typing as I was thinking about the questions today, as I was doing some research and thinking about things, I just kept coming up with many of these same points that have been made in the past few days in particular, that when women are at the table decisions are made differently. And as Fletcher just said, women are half the world, and so our voices matter. And so women make decisions differently, our thought processes are different, our skill sets are different, and in turn, policy that is made is different. So that is the lasting legacy, really. And again, the quote that keeps going around these days, although Ruth Bader Ginsburg made it popular, it's actually attributed to somebody else from the 1700s, a woman named Sarah Grimke. She said, "I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask is of our brethren is that they take our feet off our necks." And so I think that again, is the legacy of this movement.
So I would add to that. So there are a lot of social science studies that show that the legislative outcomes did change. It wasn't just philosophically, it was really relevant. So for example, there was a study just in 2008 that looked at what happened to legislation immediately following the suffrage movement, and found that, that there were immediate increases in spending on public health and policies for children. So for example, there was a door-to-door hygiene campaign that came out of this against infectious disease that reduced children's deaths by 8 to 15%. So immediately following the suffrage movement, you see these campaigns for public health and for the rights of children. And so we see those legislative outcomes. That's just one example. And then I would also add, when you look at the women's movement and the suffragists and what they did, it was the first for a lot of things. And so, the first time that people are really picketing the White House, and we go to Washington, D.C. now, we expect there to be picketers at the White House, right? I would be surprised if there weren't. But it was really the first. And so they set in motion this idea of peaceful protests when they were attacked, and they were often brutally attacked, especially towards the end of the movement, and arrested and beaten and rocks thrown at them. And they responded nonviolently. I think that set the stage for the civil rights movement, because when they responded nonviolently to those aggressive attacks, they won favor in the press. And they used that as a tactic, and then you see other movements adopt that later on. So I think it was really the first big social movement, and those tactics were adopted by all the movements that followed. And we're still seeing them today with Black Lives Matter and other contemporary movements.
I guess it just leads me to a thought experiment. I mean, if Congress is about 25% female now, and we've reached about 20 to 25% in Harrisburg, just imagine what the agenda and what the politics would be like if the legislature at the Congress, the composition of the government was 75% female instead of male. I would think that there would be a real change, further change in the policy agenda, and even the way politics are practiced, and mainly for the better. I have to say that, since I'm the male panelist. I'm the member of the oppressor class tonight.
Well, we don't see you that way on this panel, Fletcher.
Speak for yourself, Matt.
I was like, well, get to that in a minute, Matt, but okay.
Dr. McClellan, you mentioned before during your remarks at the first question about the Equal Rights Amendment. So activists have been trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment to provide women with equal rights under the Constitution for almost half a decade at this point. But so far, the amendment hasn't really gone anywhere. It failed, the state test in the 1980s. But so what do you think? Do you think that the amendment is needed, first of all? And then if so, what do you think has to happen first before the ERA can be passed, or what kind of political climate do we have to be in? And this isn't just for you, Dr. McClellan, this is for any of the panelists.
Well, I mean, first of all, the amendment itself has about a 100-year anniversary. It was proposed by Alice Paul soon after the ratification of the 19th, and she believed that just like the 14th Amendment, which guarantees due process and equal protection of the law for all citizens in the state, but mainly was intended to protect newly freed slaves, she felt that women needed that same kind of legal protection so that they would be able to genuinely enjoy the rights they just gained. It has an interesting history. It was originally backed by Republicans. It was a pro-business measure. Labor was against it for a long time because by guaranteeing equality, it meant that special legislation, special benefits provided to women that were secured by the labor movement with regards to wages and working conditions, that they might be wiped out. So it's not until the 60s and 70s when sort of our notion of when cultural change happened and people believed that women could do anything and everything and backwards and in high heels, better than men or as good as, that this idea of equality, genuine equality, set in. The obstacles back in the 70s and 80s, once again, the Republican Party turned away from the amendment after having supported it for so many years. Ronald Reagan joined with the anti-ERA movement and the moral majority to oppose it. He said he was for the E and the R, but not the A. The Republican Party also became a pro-life party or anti-abortion party. And Phyllis Schlafly, the famous activist, organized opposition, especially among women with traditional views of women and their place in society, and gathered lots of opposition in the South. And most recently, though, and the amendment stopped only 3 states short of ratification. Now we have 3 additional states that have joined. So there are 38 states on record, but there are enormous legal issues. One is that we had several states who initially approved, but then rescinded their approval, in the last several decades. There was a legal deadline that was given to ERA ratification in the 80s. That's long past. And now we have the interesting question, when this amendment was proposed, whether you're thinking about the 1920s, the 1940s, or the 1970s, people mainly thought about this in a binary way, and that equality of rights on the basis of sex was, in the minds of many, intended to protect both sexes, but of course women. Now with the recent Bostock ruling that rules that sex in the Civil Rights Act, Title VII, protects not just people on the basis of sex, but also on the basis of sexual orientation. That is now a new consideration whether the Equal Rights Amendment protects not just people of both sexes, binarily speaking, but also LGBTQ people as well. It's a long period in the courts, I think, that will be negotiated. Some would say, let's just start over, it's a mess. Certainly, I think, a change, a party change in Washington would help, but I think a lot of these issues have to be resolved in court, which of course is now increasingly being filled by Trump judges.
Thank you, Fletcher.
I was going to say, I could just weigh in briefly to say that I definitely think it's important to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Matt, to your question, and just, right now, one of the women that is being floated around to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg for the Supreme Court actually belongs to a very narrow sect of Catholicism that believes that men should be in charge and women should be subservient to men in accordance with the Bible verse that you're probably familiar with that says that. So that's why I think that we still need things like the Equal Rights Amendment, because while some folks may think that women already have equal rights, there's so many folks that don't necessarily believe that that's the case. And to Fletcher's point about the quote unquote moral majority, those rights will continue to be hacked away at by a minority of people, but nevertheless, so I think it's important that we do it. I think gender parity in the state legislatures and in Congress is what's needed. well, we could get it if the parties change in Washington. I think there's so much to do. I doubt the Equal Rights Amendment will be at the top of the list of things to do, unfortunately. But I do think that paying attention to what's going on at the state legislative level, as well as the congressional level in terms of gender representation, will be important to us securing that in due time.
Thanks,
And
Christina.
then I would just add, so Fletcher mentioned in the previous answer just how difficult the amendment process is. And so I just don't see this on the horizon. But it's also a good lesson that you don't always need a constitutional amendment to expand rights. And so the courts over time have just made rulings that in effect have created an equal rights amendment. The courts have ruled again and again and again that the Constitution applies to men and women. And so does it need to say it? It would be a great symbolic victory. But like Fletcher said, it's a difficult process. And there are other ways to expand rights without amending the Constitution.
And Ruth Bader Ginsburg was responsible for the legal theory that brought about the string of cases that protected women and men from gender discrimination.
I'm going to go back to something that was mentioned by Christina. How were women of color marginalized from the suffragist movement in the US? And connected to that, are there particular Black, Indigenous, or other women of color who played a large role in the movement that maybe we should know about that have historically been excluded or just are not highlighted the way Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan B. Anthony are given a lot of attention?
So yes.
It's a leading
Here's
question.
where, again, I would point to understanding the socio-political context is really, really important. So it's easy to pull out statements made by the suffragists that sound really racist. They argued for separating the Black women away from the white women to get their cause through. And they are racist. I mean, they sound bad and they are bad. But the context is that, you know, at the beginning of the movement, you had the abolitionist movement and the suffrage movement moving together, and the political leaders again and again said the country can't handle both. The country cannot expand rights in both directions. It's just not going to happen. And so they pit these two movements against each other. And, you know, a lot of times when you're hearing the women, the suffragists say things where they're excluding the Black movements, they are making statements about wanting to include them, but there's this pragmatic realization that they need the support of the Southern states. And the more you involve the women, the Black women in their suffrage movement, the less likely you are to actually gain rights for anyone. And so, you know, there's some writings where they're arguing that, okay, let us just get this first and we will pull them along, but we can't have them in the front or none of us are going to gain anything. And so there's this realistic understanding that was toxic. In terms of women, Ida B. Wells, who came out of Illinois, who had granted partial voting rights in some elections to women. And she ran an organization called the Alpha Suffrage Club. And she was a journalist who got her start by exposing lynchings and the horrors of lynchings and what was happening. And she, her motivation for women's suffrage was to allow Black women to vote, to bring more justice to the Black community, to further protect those rights that were being marginalized. And she showed up at the big women's march in Washington, D.C. on Pennsylvania Ave, and, arranged by Alice Paul. And she tries to join the Illinois women's delegation, and they have this little skirmish, and they tell her to go away, that they don't want to be seen with the Black women's movement because it will hurt their cause. Go to
the back of the line is what they said.
Yeah, get the back of the line. And they do. And then, if you know about that parade, it ends in violence. The parade is really attacked at the end. And at the end, you just kind of get this, Ida B. Wells and her group just kind of marching through after the skirmish has ended. But it was the political context of the time that they were told again and again and again by people in the South that they could not join their movement. They were allowed in some state movements, so there was much more involvement of Black women in the suffrage movement in things like in the act to get it passed by the state of New York. So New York was much less segregated, much more open to Black women's participation. Then you see their movement in some states, but on the national scale, it was toxic because of the opposition from the South.
Yeah. I don't know if Fletcher or Christina wanted to add to that. That was a very good answer. Thank you. We had a couple questions that are actually specifically for Christina, the politician on the panel. So Matt, I guess Matt, you could ask the first one.
Yeah, absolutely. So Christina, we were wondering, how has your gender impacted your experience in politics, both as a politician and as a person working sort of adjacent to the political realm and international development and things like that?
I have the disadvantage of both being a woman and looking young. I'm 43 and I've looked young my whole life. So just because what you said, my career as well, it's definitely very hard to walk into a country when you're working in international development as a 26 or 27-year-old person and meet with important people in Africa and have them take you seriously. Like, who is this little girl and why has she been sent here? And where are the adults? And interestingly, I still got that a little bit in Pennsylvania politics, I'm not gonna lie. So I think definitely it's sort of a double whammy in that way, both being a woman and looking young. Of course, if I looked older, then people would be upset that I looked old. But in any case, I think what I noticed most in being a woman in politics, so I ran for two very different offices, once for Congress and then once in Pennsylvania statewide. And I just like to draw some distinctions between those two because they were different experiences in the sense that Congress is very much interacting with folks in DC, which I've done for my whole career. And DC, while it's still a sexist place, is very different to how Lancaster, Pennsylvania operates on the whole politically. And so there's much more, particularly in the Democratic Party, much more gender parity, much more many women in leadership positions, of course, that I got to interact with. And so I didn't feel the gender divide necessarily when dealing with folks in DC about my congressional race. I definitely felt it on the ground. Again, why me? Why did I think that I was smart enough or good enough? Or, how dare I? Speaking of going to the back of the line, I certainly wasn't somebody who folks knew. I in many ways came out of nowhere. And that also did not, because sort of the compounding of me being a woman, I just got asked a lot of extra questions that a man wouldn't get asked as to why he thought he was so special to be able to do this. At the state level, I draw the distinction because Pennsylvania is quite archaic in its politics. And I like to say that we like to party like it's 1776 because we do. And so that goes all the way down to, the old, sort of old boys network, backroom deals, cigar smoking, all of it. It's very arcane. And that is really, really, truly, at least in part, maybe not in full, but how a lot of things operate. And you can see it throughout the state of Pennsylvania. So wherever you look, so this is true for chambers of commerce or for Democratic parties in random counties, right? It doesn't matter what it is. If people feel that the institution is important, you will find a man heading it up in a county. And if people feel the institution isn't important, you will have a woman heading it up. So for example, chambers of commerce in more far-flung counties that no one cares about are often actually headed by women because the men see it as like an administrative task of organizing events. Same with the parties, like you'll find that a lot of parties in more rural areas are headed by women, although not exclusively. And so these kinds of things where there's clear gender differences. But as a candidate, it impacts me because once again, I'm being held to a different standard. What is expected of me is different. I'm not ingratiated in, I'm not sort of in the old boys club. So, and also, you know, you do have generational divides as well, not divides per se, but just that folks might identify with me as their granddaughter or something like that. So in one sense, I'm able to ingratiate myself, but in another, I'm still diminutive and not in that position of power that I believe that I should hold in the running for the office that I'm running for. So those are some of the challenges. And then another one just to pick up on that's very gender-based, I think, is the raising money. So when you're raising money as a candidate, people tend to give less money to women. And then, of course, you find it's very rare, the Carly Fiorinas of the world are very rare. People who come from business and get into politics are very rare. So people like me who are in the nonprofit sector, people who are in the government sector, don't come from a world where they're making a lot of money already. So when I went to raise money, I was raising money from my nonprofit friends who also had no money. And so, you know, whereas men are usually well-connected lawyers who become congressmen and their friends are all lawyers. And so like raising money is much easier for them. They're in a high income generation position and things like that. So I would say those are the things that I've run into a bit.
Thank you, Christina. Looks like Representative White might be joining us. But might be having some trouble, not sure. But I'll pivot here a little bit, sort of related to what you were saying. How has the, this is for anybody, how has the Me Too movement impacted women's involvement with politics as voters, candidates, as well as campaigners recent years?
Yeah, I think it's had more impact on the culture, I think, so far. I mean, it's had widespread impact, you know, everywhere, but
yeah.
On culture, I think, you know, on the corporate world, certainly personal relationships. I think people are just more aware and self-conscious about this. Corporate practice has changed, certainly, you know, the law firms and people who advise, consultants, certainly have you know, gotten a lot more business out of this. In legislature, in law and legislation, we've seen a number of changes, you know, in legislatures themselves, but not as many as you might think. And once again, that may be more cultural than actual, you know, changes in policy. I think the main effect, though, has been more indirect. I think women have become themselves more politically conscious and mobilized. They've been more have, you know, are running for office. I think we had a student actually look at this in her master's thesis, and she found more indirect effects on opinion, more awareness and you know, and sensitivity to issues involving women in the workplace and discrimination and harassment and assault than directly on politics itself. But if the representative gets on, she can speak to it much better than I can.
Thanks, Fletcher.
April, did you want to take a moment or do you want me to take it?
I would just say, so I think the big gain for me of the Me Too movement was shattering the myth that there was this equality that didn't need fought for anymore. That it really opened a whole generation who thought maybe never experienced discrimination, maybe never really felt there was sexism, to see that it still happens in high places, and that it's just kept quiet. And so I think you had this new generation of women being exposed, maybe sometimes for the first time, to the idea that they will encounter sexism in their life.
That, and I would say that the legal system wasn't working for them either, that they were hushed up because of the legal system that was broken. So, and a lot of that, I think it's worth, noting that that's more news to white women than it is to women of color. And so I think it was sort of exposing that as well. And again, in the same way that we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality, that these are things that have been happening to people of color for quite some time. And it just as white people have just been clued in, not everybody, but some people have just been clued into it because it's more in the mainstream and sort of more open. And I would agree with Fletcher that I think it's helped to spark a movement for some women to get to the ballot box. I don't know that it's done a lot, per se, like specifically around politics, but with the ballot box being the only place that you can do whatever you want, and that no one will know, it is, and I used to work with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And so, for me, that was one place where you could tell folks that no matter what they did behind that curtain, no one would find out. And that's a very unique thing, because in an abusive relationship, folks are being sort of, targeted at every moment. And so I know that candidates are more willing to share these experiences. You have a lot of candidates that are running who have experienced that. We have one right here in Lancaster County, Dana Hamp-Gulick, who was a victim of domestic violence, for example. And of course, just to say that abuse and assault are the ultimate forms of control and violence, as we see now with Donald Trump. And I think women are standing up to say that we're not going to take it anymore. And I'm pretty sure you're going to see the results of that in the ballot box on November 3rd.
Thanks, Kristen.
So, Representative White, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. How are you?
I'm
Sorry
good.
for the delay.
Thank you for joining us. So if you would like to just give us a little introduction about yourself, and a question we asked Christina that we'd also like you to answer is, how is your gender impacting your experience in politics and also like outside of politics, but working sort of adjacent or in a political realm, not as a candidate?
Sure. So I am currently an elected official, Republican from Philadelphia, and I'm in the state house. So I was elected in 2015, served, almost 3 terms. I came in on a special election, which is when you fill the remaining amount of time on somebody else's term when they leave office, like our local congressman did. He ran for both state house, both his state house seat and Congress at the same time as a Democrat, and then got elected to the congressional seat. And then, I took over for the state house seat when I ran. And my background is I graduated from Elizabethtown College, so I'm super excited to be on this call. And I'm really proud to be able to represent Etown. I was wearing my mask on the House floor. You guys sent me over this awesome Blue Jay mask, so it was very nice. And I think that in terms of just another piece of my background, I went to school in the business program. So I didn't necessarily go to school for political science or some other, type of background. But I had a wonderful experience there. And now I'm, being able to benefit from my education there in what my current career path is. So I was the first kid in my family to go to college, and I was lucky to be able to get into Etown and get a academic scholarship. So I was, just really excited about that. And then, so now my career has led me to not only being a state representative, but also the Philadelphia Republican Party chairwoman in this one. I mean, it's basically the 6th largest city in the country. And it's definitely challenging when the voter registration is 7-1. When we have one party rule for 60 years, that doesn't benefit anybody. We have a lot of dereliction of duty and a lot of issues here in the city that are going unaddressed. But I think there's going to be a lot of people, and we already see that now, there's a lot of people switching their registration because they're tired of it. But in terms of, you know, your other question in terms of gender, so look, I think when we judge, well, first of all, in politics, everyone gets judged, right? We're evaluated daily on our roles and responsibilities as not only an elected official, but, you know, as a person. And we have to accept that and just know that up front. So whatever you post, whatever you say, you know, basically every move that you make is being evaluated by the public. And that's a good thing, because that's called oversight. That's called accountability. But it also, you know, leaves you in a position where you have to, you know, constantly be on point, especially, you know, as a woman, I would say that, you know, and as a younger woman, I think it's important for people to understand, you know, our perspective on issues. Out in Harrisburg, I think it's like less than a third of the General Assembly is female. And, you know, there just is a lot of opportunity for growth in that regard, because we represent 50% of the vote. So why have we not been able to achieve at least 50% of the General Assembly? And I think it's because we need more women to run for public office, because if you're not on the ballot, well, then you're not an option. And that's something that I learned very, very quickly, you know, when I decided to run for office, because in Philadelphia, a lot of times Democrats are on the ballot and they go unopposed. And so they automatically just get elected just because they're on the ballot. And I think that's part of the issue, is that we need more good people who care about their community, regardless of gender, of course, but because of their background, because of their experiences, because of their knowledge and their willingness to serve. And I think that is probably more important than anything.
Well, thank you.
I'll leave it at that. Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you. So now's probably a good time to take some questions from our audience members. So we got a question here going back to a question about the ERA, and the viewer wanted to know, they were making the argument that the ERA would guarantee equality, and that this would be a guarantee that could not be rolled back, rather than some sort of other kind of executive order or something that might not be permanent. And this person wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that, whether there was any importance to trying to, I guess, continue to work to pass it against all odds.
I'll defer. I mean, basically, is this amendment needed? I think, and
Yeah.
I think still it is to lock in gains. I think there still is a pay gap. I think there is a status gap, and you know, to the extent that that's attributed to you know, gender stereotyping. And to the possibility that some gains, you know, could be rolled back in the future. I saw in the decision by the federal judge to invalidate what Governor Wolf is doing with regards to crowd size and the pandemic. The judge relied on a precedent that went back to 1905, the Lochner versus New York case, which struck down a law which set maximum hours for people in the baking industry. I mean, when people are pulling those sorts of precedents, which have long been, you know, relegated to the trash heap. When we're going back to those sorts of things, I think anything can happen.
I also wouldn't overestimate the extent to which the Equal Rights Amendment would prohibit what we think of as rolling back. So the Equal Rights Amendment isn't going to do anything in terms of rolling back, abortion access or abortion rights. It's just not going to weigh in on things like that. So again, would it make some things more permanent? Probably. But when we're thinking about the things that are actually in danger of being rolled back, I don't see it doing much there anyway.
Thank you. Matt, would you like to take the next audience?
Absolutely. So Dr. McClellan, earlier in the panel, you also mentioned about the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the effect while she was on the Supreme Court that she had on promoting gender equality in the United States. So we had someone ask, how do you see the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg impacting voting behavior in the upcoming election? I would also like to add, why do you think, this is one of those why social science questions, why do you think certain social issues on gender matter more to certain people? Obviously they matter to women because it directly affects them, but to some men, why do you think it matters more to certain people than others? Why does it affect voting patterns in that way?
Right. First of all, and I would love to hear the public servants speak to this, but we lost, a tremendous role model, a legal giant. In terms of the politics, I can't tell you whether this is going to help Democrats or Republicans. It raises a salience of issues. Obviously, the Supreme Court itself, fear or concern about the state of reproductive freedom, healthcare, perhaps the environment, the LGBTQ rights. And so all those, constituencies, all those groups that are interested in those issues, I think will be, there'll be greater urgency. I think Republicans are already galvanized behind judges and the court and the possibility of overturning Roe and things like that. I think there's a little bit more room to grow on the Democratic and liberal side. I think, Democratic Senate candidates probably got a little bit of a boost, not just because of the issues, but more generally, I think people see through the hypocrisy of this appointment. Thinking about the 4 years ago, what happened to President Obama's appointment of Merrick Garland. Obviously, there's no principle involved here. It's just we can appoint this justice and we're going to do it. And, that's politics, and I study it and I accept it. But I think it will have an impact there. I think, anything that doesn't bring up the pandemic or the economy or Trump's performance probably helps Trump. But on the other hand, you could argue that the more, the Senate is going to be considering a justice, they're not doing anything about relief for COVID victims or for state and local governments or for small businesses. And so maybe, over time before the election, this will all wash out and we'll be on to a new issue or new outrage.
Thanks, Fletcher. Did anybody else want to respond to that one? No, okay. We do have another audience question, and this one is directed at Christina and Representative White. So the question is related to your career tracks and what was the transition between finishing your degree, and they wanted to know what you had studied in college, and then making that transition into running for office or serving in office. I guess what that path looks like.
Sure, I can take that. It's Rep. White. Thank you for the question. I would just say, when I first went to Elizabethtown College, I
I decided that I did want to study business. I didn't come in undecided or anything like that. And I double concentrated in marketing and finance, and had an econ minor. I helped with at the time was Dr. Paul. He was the chair of the business department at the time. And I worked within the department to try to help with the accreditation process. And, I played sports. I studied abroad my sophomore year. And I think that made it a little bit easier because they were more of the, the credits where they're not as important to your major earlier in your college career that you can take while you're abroad. So it provided a little bit more flexibility. I studied at the University of Gloucestershire in Cheltenham, England. And, that was through the, I think the BCA program, if I remember correctly. It's like Brethren Colleges Abroad.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure if you guys still have that. I mean, it is 2020 after all, but, it was a great experience. And we, I also, for the econ course that I took while I was in school, it allowed us to go to visit the United Nations, both in New York as well as in Switzerland. So Geneva, being able to go and see where the world, every nation can come together and find compromise and work together for the common good of the world, and help those in great need, is a pretty impressive and humbling experience, to say the least, because I think sometimes we forget how good we really do have it here in America. And, I think we also do give a ton to the world because of that, because of our success and because of our willingness to, embrace freedom, embrace a capitalist country that can lift millions and millions of people from poverty, like it has done both in the United States, but also in China. So, I would just say that, it's been an incredible experience. The way that I got into politics was, basically I was asked to run. A longtime family friend had worked within the Republican Party. She, I went to school with her kids, and she said, Martina, there's this open seat, and I think you would be great for it because you've volunteered in the community. You're just a good person. And I said, well, Mrs. Udovich, I don't think I know anything about politics, so I don't know that that's a good fit. But, she insisted that I send her my resume, and she submitted it to the Republican Party chairman at the time, which was John Taylor, who I got to serve in the state house with for a few years until his recent retirement. But, they basically interviewed me. And one of the first questions that they asked me was, what ward and division do you live in? And I said, guys, I don't even know what a ward and a division is. So, I definitely had a very steep learning curve. And in some ways, it was probably a good thing that I didn't know much about politics at the time, because had I known that my district, that I was outnumbered 2-1 Democrat to Republican in my district, I may not have ever run to begin with. But I guess that's the young, naive person at the time that I may have been. But now I would say I'm pretty much a, political expert, if you will, being able to survive and, make a great district for, the community as the public servant has been a true honor, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Thank you very much. We have a few more minutes left, and I'll let Christina Hartman give us her responses. Are you comfortable answering that more personal one about your?
Of course. So I have 2 degrees in international affairs, and a degree in international affairs from the George Washington University in DC, and then a master's in international political economy and development from Fordham University in New York City. And so I actually Representative White and I have a lot in common. I had an experience actually, not in college, but in high school where I studied abroad or spent a summer abroad and visited with folks at the State Department in Poland, so the embassy, the US Embassy in Poland. Where they gave us an orientation as to what they do every day. I'm sure the guy just stamped visas all day long, but they told us that if you work for the State Department, that you get to move to a new country every 2 years and learn a new language. And well, I was good at languages and I thought, man, I can't believe they pay you to do that. Like, you're gonna pay me to do that job? I'll take that one. And so I was, and around that same time, Madeleine Albright actually became ambassador to the UN. And so it was that helped me to understand what I would like to do with the rest of my life when I was 16. And that's how I went on to get the 2 degrees that I got and work internationally. So I've worked in Central Asia, in the Balkans, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and a little bit in the Middle East, as I said before, helping folks to do democracy and human rights work all over the world to share in that freedom that Representative White was talking about, that America is in theory known for. And so that was my career trajectory, and I got into politics. So one could say that that work is political, and it is very political in nature in its own right. However, I decided to run for office after the Jerry Sandusky child abuse scandal happened. So in November of 2011, I was in South Sudan at the time, and I thought, how could this still be happening in my home state of Pennsylvania in the year of 2011? And so I left international development in 2012, and I took a job working on domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse in New York City to try to give back to that particular issue. And after doing that for a couple years, moved back to my hometown of Lancaster and was pretty disgusted with the current representative, Joe Pitts, at the time, and thought that Pennsylvania and definitely Lancaster could do a lot better. And also that our area had changed and no one was picking up on it. And so no one asked me to run. And in fact, I also did not know my ward or district, Representative White. And when I went to the first meeting and they asked me, it's 9-1, in case you're wondering, my ward is 9-1. But yeah, so I ran because I had interestingly, we were talking about social sciences before, but I had the social science background, the statistics background, all the things that you would need the political analyst background to understand what was going on in my district and to see things that people hadn't seen. And had 2016 been a wave in the other direction in the way that it was in 2018, I would be sitting in Congress right now. And so it was because of those political skills and analytical skills that I gained through my degree and my work that I was actually able to make that let's say, sort of assessment and make that decision to run for office.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to my co-moderator, Matt Smith. And thank you to all our attendees. And have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.